Okay, so miracles. I don't know, wouldn't they violate the laws of nature? Is it even possible to believe in miracles today? And if you're a Christian, is it possible to be a Christian but not believe in miracles? So my topic today, obviously, is miracles. Miracles occupy a central place of importance within the Christian faith, as they do in most religions. I'm going to be discussing various aspects of the miracle debate, and of course, I will be giving you my own take. So I think it's basically impossible to discuss a topic like this, or at least I would find it impossible, without one's own biases coming through. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I've thought about this. I've studied theology, I've studied religion, so I thought about this topic. I have my own opinion on this topic, obviously. And by the end of this video, you'll know what that opinion is. In saying that, however, I do very much welcome objections. I welcome your disagreements. I am being argumentative in this video, as I think that is basically the most productive and the most interesting way of engaging with topics like this. But I'm not really trying to convince you that I'm right. I'm not trying to convince you of my position. I'm not trying to win you over to my side.
Yeah, well, that's just your opinion, man.
So by all means, do disagree. And on that note, I do welcome your disagreements in the comment section below. Your disagreements, your comments, whatever else. And of course, if you do find this content of interest, then of course, please do subscribe because, reasons. Okay, so miracles. So where's the battlefront? Where is the friction? Who has skin in the game? What comes to mind for me first is conservative, evangelical, so-called Bible-believing Christians going head-to-head, often on YouTube, with the kind of new atheist types. And just to invoke for a moment some kind of rudimentary straw men, you've got the evangelical, and we can kind of pare their position down to, the Bible says so it must be true. And then you've got the new atheists, and they basically just have the one card that they always play, the kind of invocation of science. And the new atheist rarely goes further than that. Miracles are not possible. Why? Science. So I find both of these positions at face value unconvincing and frankly uninteresting. We can certainly, and hopefully over the course of this video, we will be going a lot deeper than this. But I think it is just worth noting or observing that it very often does not go deeper than this. There are countless hours of content on YouTube with atheists going head-to-head with Christians, just hitting that same relentless drum. In fact, entire careers have been born out of that. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. Infinitum. When I think Christianity, theology, miracles, the first thing that comes to mind for me is C.S. Lewis and his books, his essays on the topic of miracles. It was for obvious reasons, a recurring theme for him, as you can probably imagine. So I'm going to be giving you a flavour of his argument. This will not be an exhaustive summary, obviously. Otherwise, this would be in danger of becoming a PhD, which I'm not setting out to do here. So he starts with the proposition that before we can look at any text, such as the Bible, to determine if miracles happened in history, we have to first establish, philosophically, whether a miracle occurring at all is even possible. So he sets up a dichotomy to explain this. He says that naturalists believe they exist within a closed system, right? So this is the closed system, which is, the cosmos, the universe, everything, and we are within that closed system. Everything that happens finds its cause in something that came prior within the system, all being contained. If an apple hits the ground, bang, it's because, I first let go of the apple. On the other hand, the supernaturalist believes that there is something beyond the system, something that lies outside of the system that can have a bearing upon the system. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, this means, God or angels can reach into the system and change something. And as such, from within the system, from our own vantage here within the system, when a miracle occurs, something happens that doesn't seemingly have a cause, right? It just happens. And I think that's really the crux of Lewis's argument. Miracles are possible. Why? Because God is capable of intervening within reality. And then Lewis turns to the Bible, and he makes claims based upon the preponderance of evidence as he sees it. For various miraculous claims. Basically, a lot of people saw it, therefore it probably happened. He points out that today many people claim that they have witnessed miracles. He says, missionaries, the Church of Rome, and just everyday folk make such claims all the time. You may have your own, story of some miracle that you think that you experienced or witnessed. And of course, C.S. Lewis recognizes that not all of those stories are going to be true. He believes that each one needs to be taken on its own merit. But what we must not do is rule out the very possibility of miracles occurring up front. So let me just give you one example. If an apple mysteriously popped into existence on a table, and there was only one person there to witness this miraculous occurrence, then it would probably be reasonable to doubt that it even happened. However, if 10 people were all gathered around a table and they all saw this apple suddenly popping into existence, and they were all, they all described the same thing, they're all completely convinced that it happened, then I think, C.S. Lewis would recognize that as being good grounds, good evidence for that miracle having occurred. Okay, so let me just start to kind of push back a little bit. Even if we grant Lewis's model, that there is this, closed natural universe, and that God is up there or outside of it and capable of kind of reaching into his creation and, giving things a little poke, I think it would be near on impossible to ascertain whether anything was actually poked. I don't think a bunch of people claiming that something happened, that something was poked, would, I don't think that would constitute sufficient evidence. It is very easy, surprisingly easy, for a group of people, especially when this group share certain cultural markers, especially if they're kind of ideologically aligned, to believe collectively that something happened which there is simply no evidence for. Which is to say, something happened which cannot be proven to have happened. And at the most kind of extreme end of this, you have what are described as mass hallucinations. So I'll give you just one example of that quickly. In 1844, in a convent in France, a nun there in the convent began to meow like a cat. And it soon spread to other nuns, loads of them, all lined up, meowing away in chorus. These kind of meowing fits came in waves, stopping for the day and then picking up the next. They tried to force them to stop, but they wouldn't. And so soldiers ultimately were brought in to whip and beat the nuns until they promised to stop. Given that there were real-world consequences for their strange behavior, and nothing that there's nothing kind of evidently to gain, it seems very unlikely that these women just chose to do this of their own volition. They were somehow kind of seized by the compulsion to do it. And there have been many cases actually kind of similar to this. There have been plagues of mass biting. There have been kind of outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing, laughing, twitching, and so on. And I don't think these types of examples are like definitive proof that miracles don't happen, right? I'm not making that wild jump. All I am saying, or all I think that these examples illustrate, is the possibility of there being collective experiences that don't require a miraculous explanation. But rather, they're just, examples of collective psychosis, a kind of collective disconnect with reality. Okay, so now back to C.S. Lewis. Let's look at one example that he gives. Reading from his essay on miracles, Lewis says, when the Old Testament says that Sennacherib's invasion was stopped by angels, which is in 2 Kings 19, verse 35, and Herodotus says it was stopped by a lot of mice who came and ate up all the bowstrings of his army, an open-minded man will be on the side of the angels, unless you start by begging the question. There is nothing intrinsically unlikely in the existence of angels or in the action ascribed to them. But mice just don't do these things, folks. I added the folks. Mice don't do these things. So, C.S. Lewis, my little friend, right. He actually does this quite a lot in his writings. He presents a few possibilities, in this case just 2 possibilities, and asserts that one of those possibilities is clearly the only reasonable possibility, the only plausible possibility. And this is what we call the false dilemma fallacy. When you suggest that there is a set number of options, which in this case there just clearly are not. And it's particularly rich given that actually in this paragraph, he's calling out fallacious logic himself. So there are loads of examples that we could linger on. But let's linger on this one because, it's not a high stakes issue, is it? I think we can explore it quite safely without potentially, unraveling your very purpose and meaning and essence of your existence. Okay, so let's begin by reading the passage in question. Okay, so this is 2 Kings, chapter 19, verse 35, which reads, "That very night the angel of the Lord set out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When morning dawned, they were all dead. They were all dead bodies." So, this is during the reign of King Hezekiah, who was one of the kings of Judah. He's the king which destroyed Moses' bronze serpent, which is not actually relevant, but it's kind of the most interesting story about King Hezekiah, so I'll just quickly tell it before I go on. If you remember, back when the Israelites were kind of wandering around the desert just after their exodus from Egypt, there's a point at which God sends fiery serpents to kill some of those naughty Israelites who weren't listening to Moses. And then Moses responds to this by making a bronze serpent, which he puts up on a pole. And so that when people went to Moses and looked up at the snake, they would be healed or they would be protected from the serpent. The iconography around the snake is quite interesting, around serpents, because they're not generally symbols of like good or protection or anything like that in the Old Testament. But interestingly, not here. Here they are a symbol of hope and a symbol of healing. And it's obviously, you might have seen it like on the side of hospitals and things like that. It's a symbol that's kind of been co-opted by the medical establishment. But yeah, so it became this idol and was ultimately, by the time of King Hezekiah, being worshipped or venerated within the temple itself. And so Hezekiah put an end to that. Okay, but anyway, back to the passage. So what we get from the passage and the kind of the context of the passage is that apparently the Assyrians were kind of nipping at the heels of Judah. They were threatening an invasion, which according to this passage, they did actually attempt, but to disastrous ends. So we run into the problem of, are we to just take the passage at its word, or should we be looking for other evidence? Later in 2 Kings, it talks about the threat, which was the king of Assyria. A threat which, according to chapter 37, never actually resulted in a single arrow being fired. So this whole kind of saga, what it reminds me of is George Orwell's 1984. The nation state always requiring a common enemy. And it feels a little bit like that the text is kind of operating like a piece of propaganda. We all have this common enemy. We can all kind of come together and share in our collective loathing for our common enemy, which in this case is the Assyrians. Actually, they did attempt to attack us. But the angel of our Lord, he came and he destroyed them all. How many, you ask? 185,000. Yeah, the angel came, killed them all, every single one. Okay, so outside of scripture, do we have any sources which, verify this event? And the answer is not really, sort of. I'll explain. So the event in question is described as the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, which happened around 701 BCE, or before the Common Era. So there's this object called Sennacherib's prism. Here's a picture of it in the British Museum. It was created by King Sennacherib, obviously, or for him, rather. He being the Assyrian king in question. So, obviously, very pertinent to our little discussion here. So, does he say on this prism that his entire army was wiped out by a bunch of angels? No, he obviously does not say that. In fact, he suggests something quite contrary. That King Hezekiah was under siege in Jerusalem. He was like a caged bird, as the prism puts it. Hezekiah ultimately relented and paid a large tribute to the king of Assyria, including jewels, including ivory, inlaid furniture, and including some of his own daughters. Now, that is a very different story. Now, of course, we can say the same thing about the prism that we did about the Hebrew Bible. This doesn't necessarily get us any closer to the truth. It could just be another piece of propaganda, but this time, obviously, from the Assyrian side. Okay, and finally, we have the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, and he was writing like 200-ish years after this event. And he offers a competing hypothesis, and that's the one that C.S. Lewis mentioned, that the Assyrian army was overrun by mice. And some historians have kind of read into this and think that it suggests a kind of mice-borne or rat-borne disease kind of spread throughout the Assyrian camp, some kind of plague. And that is what ultimately kind of thwarted their attempts to capture Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, by force. As that is actually one thing that the two sources, the Hebrew Bible and the Prism, do agree on, that the city of Jerusalem itself was not conquered by the Assyrians. Okay, so I'm not going to continue to kind of scramble my way down this rabbit hole. My purpose here was just to demonstrate that C.S. Lewis's initial assertion that there are just these two possibilities and that one is evidently wrong, that entire kind of setup is incorrect. There are, several alternative, plausible explanations, whether that be the siege scenario resulting in tribute being given, or whether that be, some kind of disease or plague scenario. At the end of the day, we just don't know. And that's a bit anticlimactic, I know. We just don't have the evidence necessary to establish, what happened on a specific day over 2,500 years ago. And we certainly couldn't establish if a miracle took place. Did an angel of the Lord show up and destroy 185,000 Assyrian soldiers? I think we read a passage like this, and what do we imagine? Angels descending with swords, maybe flaming swords, and, sweeping through the Assyrian soldiers, smashing them all down, like some kind of epic scene from some historical drama. But what if there was some plague that swept through their camp, which stopped the Assyrians' advance in its tracks? Would those who are quivering behind the walls of Jerusalem not describe such a fortuitous event as being miraculous? Could you not imagine stories being told about angels, or about the wrath of our Lord coming down and defending his chosen people when everything looked so hopeless? Could those types of stories not emerge quite naturally, the result of unbelievably good luck? Ultimately, we find ourselves in the same position. We're trying to find sufficient evidence to prove what is impossible to prove. Even if we were to allow, C.S. Lewis's assertion that we cannot rule out the possibility of miracles up front, even if we're to grant this, I think we should grant that, that does not get us any closer. And, given the way that stories can evolve within the oral tradition, given the possibility of mass hallucination, given the fact that just very improbable things can and do happen, it is, as I said, probably impossible to ascertain whether God reached into his creation and gave something a little poke, whether he caused a miracle. All of this, however, all that I've been saying so far, is not to say that I personally do not believe in miracles or the possibility of miracles. Actually, I do. Most videos in this area, whether they're arguing from a kind of course the Bible can be trusted, on the miracle question, or they're arguing from a kind of atheistic perspective, they're all appealing ultimately to your rationality. They're making a kind of point-by-point case for why their position is clearly the rational one, is the logical one. But the trouble with that is we are not rational. I've made this point in videos before, but I think it's worth kind of repeating a little bit. When people form their opinions on things, what people are mostly doing is they're allowing their sense, their intuition, their feelings to determine what they believe. And then if they think about it beyond that, they're using their rationality to justify this intuition that they've already had. And it's very difficult to get beyond that. It's basically impossible to get beyond that. When I frame it in this way, however, I think it suggests that intuition is bad, and that we should be trying to kind of get away from it or get beyond it. Get beyond it to the beautiful clarity, which is reason, logic, and intellect. Because you are rational, right? Me? Huh, of course. No one is rational or reasonable. We all like to think that we are. We all like to think that we're reasonable, but we aren't. For the most part, we're not assessing things rationally, especially in our day-to-day lives. We're going with our gut. Our gut is doing the heavy lifting. It's steering us through this world, our sense, our intuition of things. And for the most part, it is doing a pretty fine job. The problem is not our intuition. The problem has much more to do with our self-awareness. Our intuition is calling the shots, but we're not aware of that. We believe that there's like this little rational agent or this little rational man within that's kind of operating the levers. A rational agent who is logical, who is weighing everything in the balance. That's not true, though. Within the mind, there's kind of the conscious level, and then there's the unconscious level. The conscious level is what we're aware of, usually kind of what we're aware of, being one thing at a time, me talking on the screen or whatever. And your unconscious mind is kind of everything else, everything beneath the surface of your conscious awareness. But it is possible to bring that stuff to conscious awareness. Bring it up from below the threshold of your awareness. So, for instance, what I said about your intuition, you can bring, this process around your intuition into conscious awareness. So, take our intuitions around the word miracle. That alone is enough, that word alone is enough to invoke a certain sense within you, perhaps a tightness or a defensiveness, or just a kind of flippant, absurdity. You might kind of get a kind of dismissive attitude towards the very notion of miracles. But there's going to be probably strong feelings one way or another. And I think it's definitely worth kind of sitting with those feelings, because I'm not saying that they're, wrong, but they're certainly worth examining what those feelings are and why do you feel in the way that you do? What do you feel is kind of pertinent, or what do you feel is at stake? What associations does that word have for you, and on and on and on. And so, as promised, my own perspective. Yes, I do believe in miracles. I don't believe in miracles because I've had some, spectacular experience which has convinced me, although, of course, I have had kind of, fortuitous moments in my life which I can't really explain, and I think probably most people have those types of experiences. And nor is it because, I've read some account of some miracle in the Bible and I've thought, well, that's just, undeniably convincing. It has more to do with my skepticism concerning the prevailing scientific worldview, that all of this is just a material world. I'm very keen on the theories of Carl Jung, with conscious, unconscious, collective unconscious. And the notion that there is this occult or hidden realm or subterranean realm of relationships and forces at play, that resonates with me very deeply. There are these kind of archetypes that cannot be seen, but only kind of perceived intuitively, influencing things in our world in kind of inexplicable ways, synchronicities and so forth. It's as if this kind of subterranean realm has its own undulating contours, and the world and the human psyche kind of cannot help itself, kind of can't help falling into alignment with those contours. And that bearing kind of constitutes the potential for there being non-causal happenings, or what we might term in this video, miracles. What I was saying about intuition relates to this also. Our intuited sense of things, of reality, allows for so much more. We're not rational. Our interfacing with the world is, as I've explained, often irrational. We have a sense of things. We have a feeling which leads us down a particular road, which impacts upon everything. The very course of our life is probably determined, greatly by just our own kind of whim, our kind of feelings about things in any particular moment. And it's one thing to be affected by such impulses, because we all are, but it's a different thing, I think, to recognize just how affected we are, and to cultivate a kind of awareness and openness to that fact. Getting away from the notion, which so many of us have, that everything has to be limited to or ultimately explained through the narrow scientific lens. We unwittingly turn ourselves, I think, into kind of automatons. We have this reductionistic view of the human condition, as if we're just kind of, I don't know, like a blank canvas being filled up by the way of our senses, as if we're just objects, as if we're just an object perched upon a much larger object, being the world, with no purpose and no meaning. So the way my kind of, larger sense of reality plays into my understanding of Christianity has to do with miracles. Not so much my belief in certain miracles, whether certain miracles either occurred or did not occur. I find that question almost irrelevant. It has much more to do just with the very possibility of miracles. Resurrection, not in the literal sense, but rather in the sense that when everything seems impossible, even then something new can burst forth out of death, life, out of hopelessness, anger, rage, war. Even there, peace and love and kindness can emerge. Where rationality and scientism may kind of narrow in its focus and concern itself with what is possible, meaning the impossibility of the situation, I would choose hope and I would choose possibility.